Welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the break and are ready for some more amazing stories here in our story track, Code and Beyond track. Next up is Erica. Her favorite story is The Giving Tree by Shel Silverstein. And it's basically a story about human dignity, which ties nicely into GDPR. You'll see. Please join me in welcoming Erica Fisher to the stage.
Hey everyone, my name is Erica, and I have the great privilege of being head of privacy at a company whose core mission is to make the world work more openly. So if that blows your mind, GDPR should be a close second after that. So today we're going to be talking about GDPR, and my goal is to open the dialogue to you, hopefully to demystify GDPR, make it more approachable, and help you understand how it changes your relationship with your customers and with Atlassian as a platform. So just to prove to you that I'm a lawyer, I'm going to start off with a legal disclaimer. This presentation is not legal advice, okay? It is legal information. So that sounds like a really cool lawyer trick, right? Just change one of the words and it means something different. Legal information, the difference between legal advice and legal information. Legal information is general information. So I'm going to be talking to you about GDPR and how it relates to our industry generally. Legal advice would be specific to your app. So hopefully I'm going to give you enough here to get comfortable. If you have very specific questions about specific scenarios about your technology, you should consult a lawyer, and one that's not me, because I've already been hired by Atlassian. Okay, so why the focus on GDPR? So let's talk about sort of why is GDPR so of the moment? Why is this something that it has any focus? It's not the first data privacy law that we've ever seen. Well, in order to understand the context, we need to go back in time a little bit. So let's go back to 2006, about the time when cloud computing became widely adopted. This map shows the countries that had data privacy and security legislation in effect at the time of 2006. Ones that countries you would expect to see, but not very many. Now, as we move into today, here's the map of the world of countries who have data privacy legislation. They either have, they've passed it and they have varying degrees of enforcement. So again, this does not represent the consistency of these laws, and it certainly doesn't represent the enforcement level. It's just countries that have data privacy legislation as a baseline. Now, I say that because Europe has always been at the forefront of this, right? In many ways, the EU has been compared to the forerunners of the environmental movement. When we first started passing environmental laws, and people were sort of like, why are we doing this? Do we really need to? And now, sort of, if you pass a recycling bin without using it appropriately, people give you a dirty look, right? So that's kind of what the track is for data privacy. So Europe was first. Now, Europe is not the only one that, even though they've been sort of in the news for having the highest bar, after GDPR went into effect, very shortly thereafter, we saw a number of countries that passed or put into draft proposal GDPR-like legislation. So if you've been following the news, that's India, Brazil, Japan, and California, which, depending on who you ask, may be its own country. So this is all to say this is a global trend, okay? This is not something that's going away anytime soon, and investing in understanding these laws is investing in your business. Okay, so this is mostly a reminder for those in the room who are not necessarily a European citizen. This is something I have to flash up early and often with our US and Australian offices, which is a reminder that the idea of privacy is held in higher esteem in the EU. This is a quote from the European Commission, which, by the way, is the body that is in charge of enforcing GDPR. That's a fun party fact that you can take with you. And this is a statement from their State of the Union address. It says, being European means the right to have your personal data protected by strong European laws. This is a question of human dignity. Now, if that doesn't scare the shit out of every US attorney, I don't know what will. This is a very grounded principle in the EU, and it's something that is not necessarily fully there yet in the US and Australia. Privacy is not a constitutionally protected right in the US, similar in Australia. In the EU, it is. So this is an important sort of perspective to understand of where we're operating from. Okay, so what does GDPR change? It's not as though the EU and the European Economic Area didn't have data privacy laws before GDPR. They did. The problem was they were not very consistent, and they didn't really have a lot of meat behind them. So GDPR actually doesn't change a lot of what the law required. My favorite story of this is when the marketing team sounds surprised that they now have to get consent for marketing practices. I'm like, you guys had to do this before. We just weren't actually playing by the rules. And what changes is the dollar figure attached to them, right? So now the EU has got everybody's attention. So GDPR changes 3 fundamental things. The focus on individual rights, right? So everything is about the individual. Whether you're in a B2B context or a B2C context, the data travels with the individual and the rights are attached to that individual's data. The second is scope. This one's really important because it's how the EU got the entire world's attention on data privacy. Now, prior to GDPR, there was a sort of patchwork quilt of laws throughout the European Economic Area. You're going to hear me say EEA. I try not to say EU. That's only because GDPR covers the European Economic Area, which is slightly bigger than the EU. It's EU plus Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland. So the scope of GDPR is global because what the new legislation changes is it says if you are a company offering goods and services into Europe, you are caught by GDPR. That's effectively every global cloud service provider. Now, beforehand, this was done on a country-by-country basis, which is part of the reason why you saw companies like Facebook setting up shop in, say, Ireland, where the Irish Data Protection Authority was viewed as being more sort of favorable, sort of a more lenient or reasonable, depending on who you're talking to, enforcement body than, say, the German Data Protection Authority. GDPR effectively closes that loophole, so there's no more gaming the system. Finally, and probably the most prominent headline is enforcement. Right? So we've all seen the big headlines coming out of GDPR. The biggest one is the fines on the table that the EU Commission has available to them are between 2 to 4% of your global revenue. Now, that's a big number for a lot of companies. It's an even bigger number for conglomerates like Google, whose parent is Alphabet Inc., right, and has a ton of money underneath it. The fines sweep up all of that money. It's not on a product-by-product basis. So if you're a free service like Facebook, sorry, if your revenue is coming from a different stream in your company, this gets swept up there. Probably more relevant, which gets overlooked in this, is also the audit and investigatory powers that the EU Commission has. So fines are bad enough in themselves, but once you're under investigation, you're in bed with the EU Commission. Guess what? That's their job, and they have nothing better to do than spend time with you. This is part of the reason why Facebook, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the developer caught up in the Cambridge Analytica scandal are going back to Capitol Hill next week to testify again on some of the issues there. So not only is the fines bad enough, but even if you escape the fines, you may find yourself in a very long relationship with the data protection authorities if you have issues related to your data privacy practices. Okay, so what does this mean for you guys in this room? Developers and app users. So one of the main questions that we get from the developer community that I really wanted to address directly here is what is your relationship with the customer, right? Are you a data processor? Are you a data controller? How do I unpack that in the narrative of GDPR? So we're going to get into those terms in a second, but the main thing that you need to understand is you have a direct relationship with the customer installing your app, whether that's an end user or the admin, okay, 2LO or 3LO flow. You have a direct relationship. And when I say direct relationship, I mean direct contractual relationship. Okay, why is this the case? Mostly everything is hung on this little screen, which you guys have probably seen in other flows. It's very familiar. It's an installation consent screen. Believe it or not, this is actually where you create your contract with the user or with the customer. Okay, so here is an example of Script Runner. I did not get Script Runner's permission before putting this up here. Sorry, you can talk to me about it later. So anyhow, the scopes are described here, right? Like it tells the user what the app is going to do. You should have a very short form description of what data am I getting access to and what am I going to do with that data on your behalf, user. But then down here is really the important part. Right? It's sort of hidden here, right? And it happens without us even noticing it because we're all click prone. But this is where the information, this is where the consent happens. So by installing the app, you agree to the privacy policy. That is, we're going to talk about that later. That is now required as a cloud app developer. That is where you tell the end user effectively what you're going to be doing with their data. And the second is the terms of use, right? That actually protects you. That says, hey, by installing this, you can't copy our code, you can't reverse engineer it, you can't go sell it as something else. That's your contract right there, and that's where it happens, just with that one little click. Okay, so you have a relationship now. What does that mean? All right, so, and what does that mean vis-a-vis Atlassian? So to be very clear on this, Atlassian is neither a data controller nor a data processor in your relationship with the end user. We purely hand off the data as a mechanism of consent. We have a separate controller and processor relationship with the customer on our behalf. And I see some head shaking in the room. Please come to the fire pit discussion, and we're happy to address those questions later. This is your relationship with the end user. We pass the data as a conduit through our applications, okay? So when we throw up the consent screen, one of the things that we say in our contract with the customer end user is, when you install a third-party app, you are giving us permission, and we will remind you at that time, in accordance with what that app wants to do, to give the data over to that app. Once the data is over to you, you are responsible for it in either a controller or a processor position. We'll talk about that in a minute. This is just a reminder that this can be in either a B2C environment or a B2B environment, right? So you may have an end user individual who you have the relationship, or you may have a broader customer, depending on whether the admin has authorized end users to install apps on behalf of the company. Okay, so am I a data processor or a data controller? The answer is you're probably both. Okay, so just a quick summary here, trying to boil this down, a complicated legal concept in as sort of simple terms as possible. Where you are a data processor, you are using the data that the end user provides you to provide the service, okay? So if you, for example, are Tempo and you have timesheets, you are using that data to provide information back, reflect information back to the end user about certain projects and the timesheets related to them. Where are you a data controller? You're a data controller where that personal data is used for things related to the service. Okay, so what's the difference there? Well, things related to the service may be marketing, they may be billing. If either of those fall down, the service does not cease to exist in the strictest form. Okay, so that's where you separate those two things. Why is that the case? Well, because as a data processor, you have a smaller subset of obligations under GDPR than you do as a data controller. So that means that if a user asks you, say, for example, to delete their data, you may need to do so as a processor because you're no longer providing a service to them. They have effectively terminated their contract with you. But you may need to retain data for marketing purposes, for example, to say, no, I need this user's email address to say, don't market to them anymore. Or I need this user's email address for my billing records because they were a technical or a billing contact. GDPR allows for that, but they say in those cases you're a data controller, which means you have additional security and confidentiality obligations if you choose to retain that data in perpetuity afterwards. Okay, so breaking down that concept, and that was like a very quick overview of sort of the players in GDPR, what do you prioritize? So you're a company, probably most of the people in this room, 50 to 100 people in your company. You have limited resources and time. Let's be realistic. GDPR is not the thing that's making you money. So you want to be sort of smart and tactical about how you address GDPR. It's sort of like we're all on the information highway together now. There are rules of the road, but certain rules apply more to others depending on what context you're in. So you want to understand the rules that apply to you the most and that are most important. The way I would break this down is prioritize your public-facing practices. These are the things that are easy for customers and regulators to spot, right? So like if you have a customer that is particularly sensitive to these things, or you have a regulator with a lot of time on their hands, you want to prioritize the things that by visiting their website or engaging with your products are easy to see that you're out of compliance. Once you have those nailed down, then you're going to move to your internal practices. These are things that really are only visible upon audit or investigation, so you have a little bit more air cover, right? If you have your external things right, then your internal things aren't going to be as apparent. The way I describe this to our teams, it's sort of like if someone drives by your house, you want all the lights to be on. You may not be ready to have people over for dinner or have them come inside the house. You can get to that later, but you at least want it to look like somebody is living there. This is just a practical strategy point. It's also the things that the regulators and customers care about the most from a risk perspective. Okay, so what do those things look like? Public-facing practices. You need to have a privacy policy. If you don't already, or if you're not sure that you have the right one, go to your inbox. You have probably 500 examples from companies that have emailed you in the past 6 months with updated privacy policies. They're all generally the same. They all follow a general same format, and there's great templates of this available online. The great thing about GDPR is the whole point is to make it common sense and make it relatable to the end user. So chances are, if you're telling the end user what you're doing with their data, you're doing the right thing in a privacy policy. So in quick summary, you want to tell them what data are you collecting, how you're collecting it, when they use the products, through analytics, when they request something, through a support channel. who you're sharing that data with, if there's third parties that you're sharing that data with, particularly to provide the services, AWS, Redis, you need to tell them who that is, and their choices related to the service. Okay, so what are their choices related to the data? All right, the next thing is you need to make sure that you have an appropriate data transfer mechanism in place. Now, some of you have probably heard about standard contractual clauses. This, again, is something that's fairly templatized. They're called standard contractual clauses for a reason. They're relatively standardized, and you can find these online. A lot of your customers will be asking for these, and so you need to understand what terms you want to put in place with them. The second is Privacy Shield certification. If you come to the Fire Pit talk, we'll discuss a little bit more for those who have questions about the current state of Privacy Shield. But keep in mind, Privacy Shield certification is only good for data transfers from the EU to the US. Now, if you're not moving data outside of the EU, you don't need a data transfer mechanism. However, I would caution you and keep in mind that it's very hard to keep that footprint within the EU. Even if you have people accessing data from outside of Europe, the EU Commission considers that a transfer for which you need an appropriate data transfer mechanism. Data processing agreements. This is where you tell the customer what your data transfer mechanism is and make a bunch of promises to them. Now, if that sounds scary, like what promises do I have to make? These are actually prescribed in GDPR, so there's not a lot of wiggle room. Everyone has to make the same promises. They're in what's called Article 28 of the GDPR. Article 28 contains those required terms. Again, there's a lot of great templates online. If you're not sure where to start, I actually would recommend going and pulling AWS's DPA. Basically, if you promise what AWS promises, which is pretty reasonable, you're going to be in good shape. Customer DPAs, so this is something that you need to be able to offer to your customer. This is available through a lot of websites. You can sort of go and at Atlassian, we have this process on our website. Other AWS has their process on their website. But the other party that you need to be able to get DPAs from are your sub-processors or your vendors that you engage. So anyone that's providing the service to you directly, if you're handing them off personal data, you need a DPA in place from them. Marketing consents. This is something that's really easy to spot if it's wrong. Okay, so that's, again, these public-facing practices focusing on regulator and customer-facing. You need an opt-in consent before you email people. What this means in GDPR world is a standalone consent with a checkbox. Now, if you're not sure how to do that, follow the lead of a lot of other companies, which is you have to email your end users and say, is it okay for me to continue sending you this content? Now, I want to take a moment here and just pause. Marketing is different than a drip email where you're helping a user optimize their products that they've purchased from you and sharing features with them. It is also different from giving them updates about the current product that they're using. Typically, this means a cross-sell. In every email that you send, you need an easy unsubscribe link and a way to track that. GDPR requires that where you're getting consent from somebody, it's as easily revocable as where you provided it. That usually means from within the communication itself. And finally, if you have a website, you need a cookie banner. This can be as simple as pointing somebody to their browser settings, but I think you should all be very familiar with this. For those of you in the room who are not from the EU but are visiting here, you now are very familiar with it after spending a few days in Europe and being online. Okay, internal practices. Data inventory. This is required by Article 30 of GDPR. This is basically a list. There's an Excel spreadsheet format online from the CNIL, which is the French Data Protection Authority. This gives you a sense of how advanced regulators are, that they're still using Excel spreadsheets to track data. But it gives you a great starting point. There's also SaaS tools available if you're interested in spending money on this. But basically, you need to start to catalog what personal data you have, where it's stored, who has access to it, and how you're using it. Now, these internal practices, let me just caveat and say that don't let perfect be the enemy of good. It can be overwhelming to get some of these things in place, and I can tell you right now there are many very large companies that are still working on getting these fully complete, and it will be an ongoing process. But start somewhere so that you have something to show in the event that you have an investigation or an audit. Data security. What does GDPR require? Mostly it requires benchmarking. So being here, attending the security sessions and talking to one another about what you're doing is a great starting point, because that shows that you understand what your peers are doing. Test, even if it's once a year. Show that you are actually testing your security practices. And finally, Brendan mentioned earlier today in the keynote, we will be publishing some vendor guidelines that will help you run incidents and understand what baseline we expect. Those are also requirements once they are published, that you should read those, understand them, and raise any questions about how to follow them. Finally, data management. So you need policies around data management. Now again, this is an area where don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Start somewhere. How are you managing data? What system are you managing in? Who has access to it? Okay, even if that's just a list of, hey, developers get access to production data, this set of people get access to test data, this set of people get access to HR data, something is better than nothing. And then finally, data retention. How long are you keeping that data? The policy here actually doesn't matter. I get a lot of questions here. What's reasonable? How long should it be kept? As long as it's tied to some rule of reason, you're pretty good as long as you have a policy and it's not we keep data indefinitely. Okay, so finally, just to wrap up, one practical real-world example. What about these guys? Okay, so on the right, we have Mark Zuckerberg. Unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know who he is. He represents the platform. On the left, you have Alexander Kogan. He's the developer in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. What have we learned from Cambridge Analytica? Now, this is a really unfortunate tale, but there are some really rich learnings that came out of it, both for Atlassian and our developers. And here's some of the changes. For Atlassian, we need more programmatic controls. You guys need to know what's expected of you, and there needs to be sort of routine check-ins. One of the complaints about Facebook's processes was that they didn't actually enforce any of the terms that they had. There was no audit program, there was no information or education for developers. In fact, Alexander Kogan said himself, if I thought that I was doing something that was going to jeopardize my relationship with Facebook, I never would have done it. Had they come and audited me and just told me, I would have changed the way that I was handling this data. On the developer side, you want to limit your use of data. Now, that means that you're not using data for any and all purposes, that you're very clear about what you're using the personal data for, and that you have boundaries that are clearly communicated about that in your organization. Technical controls that we'll be building into the platform. If you go to Jason's talk, which is at 4:50 in the Arenas Room 1 next door, he'll talk a little bit more about how we're going to make these technical controls more self-service. On your side, you'll limit the scope of data that you call, okay? So data is now a liability, and data minimization is a real thing under GDPR. Only call the data that you absolutely need, and once you have it, make sure you have controls about how to get rid of it, how to secure it, and how to manage it. Finally, we'll be working more towards education and awareness. This is a good start, but we want to make sure that you guys are empowered to understand what your obligations are under GDPR and have that dialogue in a helpful way. And finally, you should comply with the platform terms. This is not everyone's favorite task, but you do need to read the developer terms and the marketplace developer agreement and understand what you're agreeing to. That is your contract with Atlassian, and those terms are important. Okay, so I'm a little over time. That was a speed through GDPR in 20 minutes. If you have more questions or would like to discuss further, we're going to be in the fire pit at 5:20 today.